They said I'd be out for a few hours after the C-section, but I woke up way too soon. My head felt like it weighed 100 pounds. My arms were numb and everything around me seemed far away, like I was underwater or dreaming. I couldn't talk, I couldn't move, but I could hear every word. My mother-in-law was standing right next to my bed. She didn't whisper. She didn't even try to hide what she said. "If it's a girl, leave her. We only keep boys in this family." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body just wouldn't work. Then my husband, my own husband, said something I'll never forget. "Don't worry, I already signed the papers." I didn't know what papers he meant, but I knew it had to do with our baby. My baby. The one I carried for 9 months. I blacked out again. And when I finally came to, I was holding her, my daughter, safe, warm, wrapped up in a soft pink blanket. That's when the nurse leaned down close and said something that shook me to my core. "Your son recorded everything they said while you were unconscious." I didn't grow up knowing what a real family felt like. I bounced around from foster home to foster home. I learnt pretty early not to expect much from anyone. I kept my head down, followed the rules, and promised myself that one day when I had a family, it would be different. It would be safe. It would be loving. It would be real. That dream started to feel possible when I met Darren. He was older, confident, had this charm about him. He really listened like no one ever had before. I was 20 working night shifts at a diner in Sacramento, barely making enough to cover rent on my 1-bedroom apartment. Darren would wait for me after every shift, sometimes with flowers, sometimes just that smile that made me feel like I mattered. We got married a year later. Looking back, I wish I'd listened to that quiet voice in the back of my head. The one that whispered every time he snapped at a waitress or brushed off something I said. But when you grow up craving connection, even someone trying to control you can seem like they care. I got pregnant with Zeke 3 months after our wedding. That's when I first saw the real Darren. He didn't want to hear about my morning sickness. He skipped all the doctor visits. And when I cried because my ankles were swollen or my back hurt, he said I was being dramatic. But when Zeke was born, something changed, at least for a while. Darren actually seemed proud. He posted pictures. He even called me his warrior. Then his mum moved in, Barbara. She showed up with 2 suitcases and a cold, unreadable stare. She said she came to help. But within a week she had taken over. The kitchen changed how Zeke was fed and told me I was holding him the wrong way. She never had to raise her voice. Every word she spoke came laced with superiority. Every look she gave was a silent judgment. Darren adored her. Anytime I said something, he'd just reply, "She knows what she's doing." She raised 3 boys, and if I pressed him harder, he'd either go quiet or disappear for a day, so I stopped pushing. Over time, I learned how to live quietly in my own home. I tiptoed around her, cooked meals she preferred. I gave up on having friends over. I stayed home while Darren and Barbara went to events together. To them, I wasn't a wife or a mother. I was just the person who gave birth to the next generation. Zeke became my everything. He was kind and curious, always full of questions, always watching. He'd sit next to me while I folded laundry, helping match the socks. He saw everything, even the things I tried so hard to hide. When I found out I was pregnant again, a tiny flame of hope sparked inside me. Maybe this time would be different. I wanted a girl. I never said it out loud, but I dreamed of her. I imagined brushing her hair, reading bedtime stories, showing her what real love looked like. I told Zeke he might be getting a sister. He smiled wide and asked if he could help pick out her name. But the moment Darren found out, something shifted. He didn't say much, but I could feel it. He stopped sleeping beside me. He stayed late at work. Barbara grew colder than ever. One night I overheard them whispering in the kitchen. I couldn't catch the words, but I knew that tone. Something was wrong. Still, I tried to stay focused. I took my vitamins. I talked to the baby. I told her how loved she already was. I kept smiling for Zeke. I told myself Darren was just stressed that Barbara would warm up eventually. I tried to ignore the growing fear inside me every time I caught them staring at me with something worse than indifference, something that looked a lot like contempt. By the time I was 8 months pregnant, I was completely worn out. My body ached all over. The only thing that brought me joy was Zeke. He'd read little stories to my belly, tell his baby siblings silly jokes, and sometimes crawl into bed with me when I cried quietly at night. Then, early one morning, my water broke. The contractions hit fast and hard. Darren didn't even bother helping me pack. Barbara complained the entire drive to the hospital, saying I could have waited another week. When we got to check-in, Darren handed over some documents I'd never seen before. The nurse looked puzzled, but didn't say anything. Zeke was supposed to stay with a neighbour, but he begged to come inside just for a minute. Said he forgot a drawing he made for the baby. I didn't know it at the time, but he had tucked his old iPod into the pocket of his hoodie and followed us in. I was wheeled into surgery, overwhelmed and feeling completely alone. I prayed for strength. I didn't realise then that what was about to happen would rip apart everything I thought I knew about the people I loved most. And I had no idea that my 9-year-old son was about to save his baby sister's life. The second they rolled me into that cold operating room, I could feel it. Something wasn't right. The lights were too bright, the air too still. Darren stood near the door, not beside me. He didn't hold my hand. He barely looked at me. Barbara was just behind the curtain, whispering something to a nurse with this tight-lipped smile that never reached her eyes. I felt exposed, isolated, scared. A nurse leaned over and asked if I had signed the consent forms. I blinked, confused. I hadn't seen any forms. Before I could speak, Darren stepped forward and said, "Already taken care of." His voice was smooth, casual, like it was no big deal. The nurse paused, glanced at me, then gave a small nod and walked away. They placed a mask over my face to start the anesthesia. My heart was pounding. Everything inside me screamed to fight it to stay awake. But I was so tired. I closed my eyes, but I didn't fully go under. I floated somewhere in between half-conscious drifting. I couldn't move my arms or legs. My mouth wouldn't work. But I could still hear. That's when I heard Barbara's voice. "If it's a girl, leave her," she said clearly, like she was commenting on the weather. "We only keep boys in this family." Her words cut through the haze in my mind like a blade. My body stayed still, but inside I was screaming. I tried to open my eyes. I tried to move. Nothing happened. Then Darren spoke. "Don't worry," he said. "I already signed the papers." My thoughts were spinning. Papers? Leave her? What were they planning to do? Panic lit up my chest, but I was trapped, locked inside myself. I wanted to yell his name, demand answers, beg someone, anyone to help. But I was paralyzed, forced to listen. "I told you she wanted a girl," Barbara added. "She's weak. Girls make women soft. You start giving them choices and they think they matter." That's what Barbara said. And then Darren laughed. "She'll never know. She's too drugged. Just have them say there were complications." I couldn't wrap my head around what I was hearing. This was my husband, the man I had loved, shared my life with, trusted. This was the woman who had lived under my roof, held my son in her arms, eaten at my table. And they were talking about discarding my child, my daughter. Somewhere in the hallway I thought I heard a faint sound, a soft shuffle like fabric brushing against tile. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but later I'd realized that it was Zeke, hiding just outside the operating room, clutching his old iPod inside his sweatshirt pocket. He hadn't gone home like they told him. He had followed us. He heard everything, and he hit record. Inside the delivery room, the surgery began. I couldn't feel pain, but I could feel pressure. My ears were still working, and every noise around me felt 10 times louder. I heard Barbara say, "If it's a boy, I'll call my sister right away. She'll be thrilled." And Darren, his voice ice cold, said, "We'll just say she never made it." No one mentioned me. No one asked how I was doing. It was like I wasn't even a person, just a hurdle, something they needed to get past. One of the nurses asked about the baby's name. Darren said, "No name, we'll decide later." Another nurse asked about discharge plans. He told her everything was already arranged, but not everyone stayed quiet. Her name was Maya. I didn't know it then, but I would never forget her. She asked questions, real questions, and she didn't let vague answers slide. When Darren got annoyed, she didn't argue, she just stepped away. And that's when she saw Zeke in the hallway. She noticed the iPod in his hand. He looked up and told her he had something important. She didn't ignore him. She listened. Zeke, with his small hands shaking, played the recording right there for her. Maya didn't panic. She didn't make a scene. She gently placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "You did good, sweetheart." Then she turned around and walked straight to the charge nurse. Back in the OR, I was starting to fade. My heart felt heavy. I could hear voices, but they were getting fuzzy. One of the doctors said I was losing blood. Another said they were increasing the meds. I wasn't sure I'd ever wake up again. I remember praying not for myself, but for my baby. Please let her be okay. Please let someone notice what's happening. And someone did. My son did. Zeke didn't cry. He didn't run. He recorded everything they said, and he handed it to the one person who refused to pretend nothing was wrong. When I finally opened my eyes again, the room was dim and still. The first thing I noticed was the weight in my arms. I looked down, and there she was, wrapped tightly in a soft pink blanket, her tiny chest rising and falling against mine. She had a full head of dark hair and the sweetest lips I had ever seen. My daughter. She was alive, and she was with me. Tears welled up in my eyes before I could even say a word. I didn't fully grasp what had just happened, only that she was here, safe, breathing, real. Then I saw the nurse standing beside me. She wasn't rushing off or charting like the others. She was watching me closely, her expression serious but kind. She leaned in, speaking softly so only I could hear. "Your son recorded everything she said. He got it all what they said while you were unconscious." I stared at her, struggling to understand. Then, like floodgates opening, the memories came rushing back. Barbara's voice, Darren's words, the papers I never saw. My chest tightened. I pulled my daughter in closer, terrified they might still try to take her from me. The nurse's voice stayed calm and steady. "You're safe now, she's safe. But we need your help to keep it that way." I blinked, trying to shake the dizziness in my head. "What do you mean?" I asked. "My name's Maya," she said. "I'm the lead nurse on this floor. Your son came to me during the surgery. He was hiding in the hallway with an iPod. He recorded a conversation between your husband and his mother. It's disturbing, and we've documented everything." I was still trying to wrap my mind around what Zeke had done, that my 9-year-old had understood what I couldn't even say out loud, and that he took action while I was completely helpless. Maya went on, "We've reviewed the audio. The hospital administrator has listened to it. It's enough for us to launch emergency safeguarding measures, but I need to know if you're willing to cooperate." I nodded instantly. "Yes, anything. We've separated your husband and his mother from this floor," she said. "They don't know we're acting on any of this yet. We told them you were still sedated and that the baby was being observed. We're giving you a head start." She handed me a clipboard with a short form. "This is a formal statement giving us permission to place a protective hold on your daughter and notify Child Protective Services. It also grants you full medical decision-making power without needing your husband's consent." My hands trembled as I took the pen. Signing it felt unreal. Just hours ago I was unconscious, on the verge of being erased from my own life. Now I was reclaiming it with a single signature. Maya took the form back and gave me a steady, reassuring nod. "You just gave her a future. I asked to see Zeke. A few minutes later, he walked in with another nurse. His face lit up when he saw me awake, but his eyes quickly moved to the baby in my arms. "Is she okay?" he asked, voice trembling. "Did they try to take her?" I shook my head and opened my arm for him. He climbed onto the bed, carefully curling his small body against mine. "She's perfect," I whispered. "And she's here because of you." He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at her, wide-eyed, protective. Then he whispered, "I heard them. I didn't know what to do, but I remembered you said we always protect the people we love." "You did everything right," I said, pressing my lips to his forehead. "You saved your sister." Outside our room, Maya and the hospital administrators started the process. Security was briefed. Social services were alerted. Darren and Barbara were still in the waiting room, unaware that their every word had been caught by the one person they never saw coming. I watched through the small glass window as a hospital administrator approached them. Barbara crossed her arms, clearly irritated. Darren looked like he was losing patience. A few minutes later, both Darren and Barbara were quietly escorted out of the hospital by security. No shouting, no drama, just consequences. I didn't feel like celebrating, not yet. There was still a long road ahead, legal battles, custody hearings, a future without the man I once believed I'd grow old with. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. I looked down at my daughter, then over at my son. No one would ever threaten them again. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was fighting back. Darren and Barbara had no idea what had hit them. They sat in the hospital's family waiting room, flipping through outdated magazines, their faces calm, calculated. Darren kept checking his watch. Barbara's lips moved in quiet disapproval every time a nurse walked by, without offering an update. They were completely in the dark. They didn't know their plan had fallen apart. They didn't know a nurse, a child, and a mother who refused to stay silent had rewritten the ending. Back in my room, Maya stood next to me, arms crossed, eyes razor-sharp. Just behind her stood Claire, the hospital administrator, with a folder in hand. They had both listened to the recording Zeke made. I didn't need to hear it again. I remembered every word. But knowing it was real, documented, undeniable, that gave me strength. Claire looked at me and said, "We're ready. Do you want to stay here or move somewhere more private?" "I'm not hiding," I said. "Not anymore." Zeke was sitting in the chair beside my bed, his hand resting on his sister's tiny foot. He didn't flinch. He didn't ask to leave. He was ready to see it through. Maya placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and gave me a look. "We're with you." Minutes later, security led Darren and Barbara into a private conference room under the pretense of an issue with insurance paperwork. Claire and Maya were waiting. Without warning, they played the recording. Darren's voice came through loud and clear. "Don't worry, I already signed the papers." Then Barbara's icy tone followed. "If it's a girl, leave her. We only keep boys." Claire paused the playback. The silence that followed was suffocating. Darren tried to speak first. That was taken out of context. "It wasn't," Claire said firmly. "The recording is over 5 minutes long. It clearly shows intent to abandon a newborn. It confirms falsified documents, and it confirms your mother's direct involvement." Barbara stood up, scoffing. "I was joking. That nurse misunderstood. Where is my granddaughter?" Claire didn't hesitate. "She's not your concern anymore." Claire said, "You are both being reported to Child Protective Services and the authorities for attempted abandonment and coercion. You will not be allowed near the child or her mother while the investigation is ongoing." Darren raised his voice. "You can't do this. I'm her husband. I have rights." Maya stepped forward. "You had rights until you tried to erase your own child before she even took her first breath. You gave them up. Security was called back in." Barbara yelled all the way down the hallway. Darren never turned around once. Later I learned that the hospital had launched an internal investigation. The forms Darren submitted were found to have forged sections. Barbara had pressured a junior staff member into pushing paperwork through. that had no legal standing. They had planned everything, even my recovery. They expected me to wake up to an empty crib and no answers. But the truth, our truth, was stronger than all of their lies. Back in my room, I finally let myself breathe. I held my daughter close, gently tracing the curve of her cheek. Zeke leaned in and whispered, "She's really staying right. She's ours," I told him. "No one's taking her away." The days that followed blurred together visits from social workers, stacks of legal documents, hours spent talking with Maya and Claire. The hospital arranged legal assistance. The police began a full investigation. Within 24 hours, I had a temporary restraining order. I never had to see Darren or Barbara again. The recording Zeke made became a critical piece of evidence. It was the foundation for everything that came after. During the hearing, the judge said it was one of the clearest examples of premeditated emotional abuse and attempted child abandonment she'd ever encountered. Zeke was asked if he understood what he had done. He nodded and said, "I just knew it was wrong, and I knew my mum wouldn't be able to speak." That's who he is, a child who saw something awful and refused to look away. A child who stood up for his sister when the people who were supposed to love her chose cruelty instead. He never doubted what he felt, even when everyone else pretended everything was fine. That night, when the chaos had finally started to fade, I sat in the hospital bed with both of them Zeke, on one side my newborn daughter sleeping on my chest. The hallway lights were dim. The door was closed. For the first time in years, I felt peace. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know how I'd afford a lawyer or where we'd go when we left the hospital. But one thing was clear: we were going to be okay. Because truth had spoken, and this time it came from the smallest, bravest voice in the room. After the hospital, I didn't go home. I couldn't. That house was never really mine. Its walls echoed with their voices. Every corner held the silence I'd lived with for far too long. Instead, I was discharged to a women's support shelter with my 2 children and a fresh start waiting beyond the walls that once held me in. The transition was hard. I had nothing but a diaper bag, a few changes of clothes, and a folder full of legal documents. No car, no job, no savings, but I had them, my son, my daughter. I had the truth. And I had the kind of courage that only comes from surviving something meant to break you. Within a week, a local non-profit stepped in to help. Maya, the nurse, who never once left my side, connected me with legal aid. A pro bono attorney took on my case and filed for full custody and an emergency protection order. The court didn't hesitate. The recording said it all. Darren never even showed up to the hearing. Barbara submitted a written statement brushing it off as a misunderstanding, but the judge didn't buy it. Zeke testified in chambers with a child advocate sitting beside him. I was terrified it would be too much for him. But when he walked out of that room, he looked lighter, like a weight had been lifted off his tiny shoulders. Later, the judge told me he spoke clearly and calmly, explaining what he heard, what he saw, and how it made him feel. He told her I didn't want to lose my sister. I didn't want her to be alone like Mum was. That sentence became the heart of our case. 3 months later, I was granted sole custody of both of my children. Darren lost all parental rights. Barbara was legally barred from any contact. I didn't pop champagne. I didn't celebrate with confetti. I sat on the floor of our small new apartment and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling of finally being free. Zeke started therapy paid for through the same non-profit that had given us shelter. Slowly, his smile started to come back. He joined a kids' coding class at the community centre. He made his first real friend. At night, he still checks on me sometimes, just standing quietly in the doorway to make sure I'm breathing. But he's healing slowly, honestly, beautifully. As for my daughter, I named her Hope, because that's what she gave me. She's calm and strong with eyes that search my face like she's always trying to understand more than a baby should. She wakes up with soft little cries that disappear the second I hold her. I already see pieces of Zeke in her alert, thoughtful steady. Every time I look at her, I remember what could have happened, and what didn't. Because a 9-year-old boy found his voice when I couldn't use mine. Because a nurse refused to stay silent in a world that often looks the other way. Because I stopped waiting to be saved and decided to fight back instead. I started sharing my story in small women's groups. At first I was terrified. My voice trembled, my hands were clammy. But the more I spoke, the more I realized how many women carry the same kinds of wounds. They might not have had a Barbara or a Darren, but they knew the silence. They knew what it meant to swallow fear just to get through the day. Eventually, I was asked to speak at a statewide domestic violence awareness panel. Maya was there. Afterwards, she came up, hugged me tight, and said, "You were never invisible. They just refused to see you. But now the world does. I'm not the same woman I was in that hospital room. I'm not afraid anymore. I don't ask for permission to exist. I don't shrink to make other people comfortable. Every day I move forward, not perfectly, but with purpose. I hold my children like they're sacred, because they are. And when someone asks how I made it through, I say this. They tried to silence me. They tried to take her. They thought I would sleep through the moment they erased us. But my son pressed record and we pressed forward together. If this story moved you, if it sparked anything in you, whether anger or hope or strength, let it live beyond this screen. Like the video if you believe in the power of a voice, even one that comes from a child. Share it with someone who needs to hear that silence isn't the end of the story. Comment below, tell me how it made you feel, or share your own story. You never know who might need it. And subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this, real, raw, and never sugar-coated. Thank you for being here, for listening, for seeing us. This isn't just a story. This is proof that truth finds a